What I will attempt to do in my 5 to 7 minutes here is give you a sense of what are those considerations that lead to having good public policy. One, facts. And I think Michael's presentation was superb in providing a body of evidence that would assist policymakers in coming to the right conclusions. A second element that goes into policymaking is what I would describe as a government's core values, core beliefs. I worked in Ottawa under Mr. Harper, who had a fundamental belief that encouraging competition in the marketplace was the way to grow an economy. The current government has a more of an interventionist, is not prepared to adopt as much of a laissez-faire. A government's core sense of what is the public interest is an element that goes into the mix. Obviously, Premier Notley felt that there was a desire to make a substantive policy statement on climate change. The third element that contributes to public policy is circumstance, timing. People in government do not have control over what is happening on the agenda. I'll give you one example. Ottawa, the national government is struggling now with how to purchase for the Air Force appropriate jets. And they've gone back and forth between the Lockheed Martin, the Boeings, and then other factors come into play. This was not something that the Liberal Party had campaigned on, but it's something that is part of their day job, that you have to do military procurement. There was and it's because the planes were starting to be technologically obsolete. So there's a timing factor. In Premier Notley's case, there was the Paris conference, and as Steve was saying, Canada, Alberta, were not welcomed at most international meetings. Former Premier Prentice had said many times that the most horrible experience of his political life was when he had to represent Canada at the Copenhagen meetings. Timing does drive some policy making. A fourth element that drives policy is the need to create as broad a tent as possible. Call it consensus building, call it factoring in as many views as possible. So when the Premier of this province worked with industry and with environmental groups leading up to the announcement, in November of 2015, it was driven in part by the desire to have a credible presentation in Paris, but also to have a policy that was credible with as many people as possible, industry, environmental groups, First Nations, within this province. That's a fourth factor that contributes to good policy. Let me turn to what are hurdles that decision makers and policy perspective face. Because Michael's two solutions makes a lot of sense. You kind of say, well, why don't you just get on with it? Do the appropriate pricing of carbon, invest in innovation, and it's kind of, you're home free. In no particular order. One, the curse of short-termism is something that is affecting all governments. The constant information flow that governments have to deal with, information they have to absorb, is much more difficult today than it was 20, 30 years ago. Complex, thoughtful presentations, as Michael did, are difficult to capture in a tweet. And unfortunately, public policy is increasingly driven by short-termism and by tweets. Hurdle number one. Hurdle number two is that everybody wants to get to heaven without having to die. The reality is, as Steve was alluding to, people would like public goods to not cost anything. People would like good things to happen without necessarily having anybody to pay for it. An example, when I was president of Ontario Power Generation, electricity rates in Ontario had been frozen for like 4 years. Ran a survey asking people what they thought about electricity pricing. Was it climbing too much? Was it climbing just right? Or 60% of people felt that the electricity prices had gone up much too fast. Reality is not one that, political reality is not one that is always encumbered by facts. There's a public perception that is being fueled these days by populism, where you deny realities or facts that you don't like and focus on your own interpretation. That's a second significant hurdle to achieving good public policy. Third is, and in some ways it's an extension of my first point, is that political cycles are usually divisible by 4. Long-term capital plans, long-term strategic decisions require a much longer time frame. There is, generally speaking, little political reward for making hard decisions which have a payoff in 10, 15 years from now. It requires, therefore, a much higher degree of political courage to make the difficult decisions. Balancing the need for what has to be done with what I would call contemporary short-term political considerations is a challenge that increasingly governments are facing.